Welcome to this voyage through one of the most unsettling cases in the Arkansas Ozark Mountains recorded history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. The winter of 1887 in the distant valleys of Newton County, Arkansas, was exceptionally harsh. Early in October, snow had fallen, covering the rough landscape of the Ozark Mountains in a stifling quiet that appeared to drown out the sound of the breeze. It was in this lonely wilderness, where families lived miles apart, and neighbors were measured in hours of travel rather than minutes, that one of the most systematic and psychologically devastating hunting expeditions in American frontier history would unfold. The events began with what appeared to be a straightforward theft. The patriarch of a clan that had established along Buffalo Creek around 15 years ago, Morai Hatfield, had left behind a liquor that had been disassembled and moved during the evening of October 3rd, 1887. Not only did the still represent a financial loss, but it also violated the unwritten rules that regulated living in these highlands. The still was a sophisticated copper apparatus that was highly valuable for its time. Morai Hatfield was not a man given to shows of emotion or reckless decisions. At 52, he had weathered several hard winters, the Civil War, and the ever-present fear of federal revenue officers who sometimes swept through the hills in search of illicit distilleries. His reputation across Newton County was that of a man who said little, but whose words, when spoken, had the weight of absolute conviction. Those who knew him remembered a tall, thin man with penetrating gray eyes and hands that rarely moved without purpose. There was just one dirt path that led through thick oak and hickory woodlands to the Hatfield homestead, which was located at the bottom of a small valley. Constructed from hand-hewn wood, the main house fronted the creek to the east, while a number of outbuildings stretched back toward the treine. It was behind these structures in a neatly camouflaged hollow that Maury had operated his still for almost a decade without incident. On the morning of October 4th, when Morday discovered the theft, he made no immediate notification to his family. Instead, he spent the day inspecting the location with painstaking detail, noting every footprint, every broken twig, every disturbance in the soil. According to a journal kept by his wife, Temperance, discovered in 1963 during the reconstruction of a historic church in nearby Jasper, Morai, came to the house that evening and simply remarked, "12 men took what was ours. 12 men will answer for it." How Morai arrived at this particular figure was never addressed in any surviving source. A county sheriff's report submitted weeks later stated that there were too many footprints surrounding the still spot that overlapped to be certain. Yet, Morai's certainty about the number remained absolute, and over the next weeks, this precision would become almost ceremonial. The Hatfield clan at that time consisted of Mororte, his wife Temperance, and their 3 adult sons Zedekiah, aged 28. Phineas, 26, and Obadiah, 23. The sons were notorious in the neighborhood for having erratic temperaments and a propensity for conflict, in contrast to their father. The oldest, Zedekiah, had been incarcerated for assault in the state jail in Little Rock. 2 years before, Phineas was suspected of being involved in a revenue agent's disappearance, although no charges were ever filed. Obadiah, despite being the youngest, was possibly the most feared, exhibiting what residents described as an eerie ability to pursue anyone through the dense Ozark forest. In the weeks following the heist, the Hatfield family conducted what appeared to be a methodical information-gathering campaign around the county. They visited general stores, attended church services they had previously avoided, and engaged in chats with neighbors who had not seen them socially in years. This unexpected sociability shocked many as uncommon, but few actively questioned it. The social seclusion of mountain families often led to occasional attempts at community re-engagement. What made these contacts particularly disconcerting, according to later testimony supplied to county officials, was the nature of the inquiries the Hatfields posed. They inquired about recent purchases of copper tubing, about who might have been traveling the mountain roads on precise dates, about which families had suddenly come into unexplained money or resources. Although the questions were posed informally and interwoven with more general discussions on the weather and crops, taken as a whole, they produced a thorough map of who would have had the resources, opportunity, and drive to steal the still. Bartholomew Wickham, who managed a general shop in nearby Parthenon, later reported one such visit from Zedekiah Hatfield in November of 1887. Zedekiah spent more than an hour in the store, according to Wickham's story, which was captured in a statement provided to the Arkansas State Police in 1923. Making little purchases and having conversations that appear to be nice. However, throughout this period, he meticulously inquired about every customer who had purchased copper items, coal, or big quantities of grain in recent months. He weren't scary, Wickham allegedly claimed, but there was something in the way he asked things, like he already knew the answers and was simply trying to see if you'd tell him the truth. Gave a man the impression that every word he spoke could be incorrect. By December, it appears that the Hatfield family had identified their 12 suspects by 1887. The criteria for this identification process remained unclear, but the list, when it was eventually uncovered among family archives in 1965, exhibited a pattern that implied careful evaluation of both opportunity and capability. The guys varied in age from 22 to 55, resided within a 15-mile radius of the Hatfield property, and all had either the knowledge necessary to disassemble a complex distillery or had displayed enmity toward the Hatfield family in the past. The list included Cornelius Ashworth, a blacksmith who had previously refused to repair Hatfield equipment, Silas Peaton, who had disputed property boundaries with Morai 3 years earlier, and Jeremiah Quincy, whose own still had been destroyed by revenue agents and who might have needed replacement equipment. Others on the list looked to have been added for more subtle infractions. Nathaniel Bramley, who had been heard making harsh comments about the Hatfield family's war record. Tanner, Ezekiel, who had courted. Both Augustus Cromwell, who had testified against Zedekiah during his assault trial, and Temperance Hatfield prior to her marriage to Morai. What ensued was not a classic border battle or a sequence of violent reprisals. Rather, the Hatfield family launched what can only be called a psychological warfare operation, with the goal of methodically undermining the social standing and mental stability of every individual on their list. Cornelius Ashworth started the campaign. In light of his wife's testimony before as a traveling preacher in 1888, Ashworth started getting anonymous messages at his smithy. This was noted in church records found in 1967. These were not the usual threats. Rather, they were accounts of his intimate chats with his wife, in-depth observations of his everyday activities, and information about his business operations that no outsider should have. The texts intensified in their intimate understanding of Ashworth's life. They mentioned the whereabouts of money he had concealed, mentioned injuries he had sustained years before and told no one about, and referenced childhood recollections that he had discussed with no one except his wife. The connotation was apparent. Someone was tracking his every step, listening to his private talks, and had access to information that should have been hard to gain. Ashworth's mental state began to worsen fast. He started checking and rechecking the locks on his shop, would interrupt conversations to listen for sounds that others could not hear. He began sleeping with a loaded weapon alongside his bed. As he grew more preoccupied and suspicious, his productivity faltered. Customers saw his hands shaking as he worked, and several commented on his tendency of stopping unexpectedly to peek out the windows as if expecting to see someone observing. Of the Silas Peton campaign took a new shape. Peton was a proud man who cherished his reputation in the town above virtually everything else. Instead of making a direct threat, the Hatfields started disseminating well-crafted rumors on his personality and business activities. These reports were never spectacular enough to be rejected as plainly incorrect, but they were harmful enough to steadily destroy his position in the society. Stories began circulating that Peton had been observed meeting surreptitiously with federal revenue officers. Other stories stated he had been scamming consumers in his timber company, selling them inferior wood while demanding premium prices. Others still alluded to inappropriate connections with community married ladies. Every rumor was delicate, believable, and impossible to verify beyond a reasonable doubt. Peton found himself increasingly isolated as neighbors began treating him with suspicion and disdain. As clients moved their business elsewhere, business plummeted. He stopped receiving invites to social events, and churchgoers shunned him. This social exclusion was especially heartbreaking because it happened gradually and Peton was never able to identify a single deed or accusation that had damaged his reputation. Jeremiah Quincy's family's protection was the main objective of the psychological attack. Quincy, his wife, and his aging mother resided in a secluded cabin miles away from the closest neighbor. The Hatfields took advantage of this seclusion by giving the sense that the family was constantly being watched and might be in danger. Overnight, Quincy would discover that his sheep had been relocated to different pastures and that the gates had been left open, suggesting human activity rather than an unintentional escape. Tools would disappear from his barn only to resurface days later in spots where he was likely to find them, but arranged in ways that seemed planned and meaningful. Footprints would appear around his house after fresh snowfalls, circling the building in a methodical fashion that suggested meticulous scrutiny of every window and door. Perhaps more disturbing were the sounds that Quincy and his family began hearing at night. As stated in a letter to her sister, Quincy's wife. These sounds, which were discovered among family documents in Missouri in 1962, sounded like several individuals strolling through the woods near their cabin, always staying just out of sight. Every time Quincy tried to look into it, the sounds would abruptly stop after going on for hours, or even all night. The psychological hardship on Quincy's family was increased by their utter isolation. They could not check whether the threats were real or imagined, could not seek help without traveling unsafe distances, and could not avoid the impression that they were being relentlessly harassed by an invisible enemy that knew their every move and vulnerability. The assault against the 12 men grew more intense as winter drew on. Nathaniel Bramley began receiving visits from strangers who claimed to be traveling salesmen, but who asked comprehensive questions about his family, his income, and his daily routines. These guests would appear at irregular intervals, always polite, but constantly prying for information that had no clear commercial objective. While he was away, Ezekiel Tanner found out that someone had been breaking into his home. Personal belongings were changed to demonstrate that every room had been thoroughly inspected, but nothing was taken. Certain pages of books were left open. Food was eaten in amounts that showed the intruders had made themselves comfortable during their searches, and drawers were left half open in patterns that spelled out signals. Augustus Cromwell found his horse dead one morning, presumably from natural causes, but positioned in his dooryard in a way that obstructed his exit and required him to dispose of the carcass before he could leave his land. The fact that Cromwell's death occurred right before a crucial court appearance in which he was to testify in a different case raised the possibility that the incident was not quite natural. By January of 1888, several of the targeted men had reached breaking points. Cornelius Ashworth had given up. his smithy, and relocated his family to Missouri to live with relatives. After suffering a large loss on the sale of his land, Silas Peaton moved to Little Rock. Jeremiah Quincy had experienced what a traveling doctor described as a nervous collapse, and was confined to his bed under the care of his wife and mother. But the most unsettling thing about the Hatfield campaign was not how well it worked against these specific goals, but rather how methodically it was recorded and improved, according to papers unearthed in a hollow wall. Mordai made thorough records of every action taken against each target during the 1959 demolition of the ancient Hatfield homestead, documenting the psychological consequences and modifying tactics accordingly. These papers, penned in Morai's precise handwriting, read more like clinical observations than personal revenge notes. He recorded which methods yielded the quickest results, which males were more resilient to psychological pressure, and which family members could be utilized to exert greater pressure on. The main targets. C. Ashworth departed from Missouri Territory yesterday. Method of anonymous correspondence proved most effective for subjects of solitary disposition. Note detailed personal knowledge more unsettling than direct threats. S. Peaton requires different approach due to social nature. Reputation destruction proving slower but more complete. O. The clinical nature of these observations suggests that the Hatfield family had moved beyond simple revenge. Reads one entry dated February 15, 1888. Into something approaching psychological experimentation. They appeared to be testing different methods of mental coercion and documenting the results for future reference. As winter gave way to spring in 1888, the focus of the campaign began to shift toward the remaining targets who had proven more resistant to psychological pressure. These men, perhaps understanding what was happening to their neighbors, had begun taking defensive measures. Some had formed informal alliances, visiting each other regularly and providing mutual support. Others had reached out to county authorities, though with limited success given the remote location and the difficulty of proving that they were being systematically terrorized. The response from the Hatfield family to these defensive measures was to escalate their campaign in ways that pushed the boundaries of what could be dismissed as coincidence or natural misfortune. Farm equipment began malfunctioning in dangerous ways that could have resulted in serious injury. Wells became contaminated with substances that made the water undrinkable, but that could plausibly have occurred through natural contamination. Bridges and fences suffered structural failures that appeared to be the result of natural weathering, but that occurred with suspicious timing and frequency. Throughout this period, the Hatfield family maintained an appearance of normal community involvement. They attended church services, participated in local events, and engaged in ordinary social interactions with neighbors who were not on their target list. This dual existence of maintaining normalcy while engaging in systematic psychological warfare necessitated a degree of preparation and emotional control that speaks to the campaign's organized nature. Temperance Hatfield's diary entries from this time period, which were found among church papers in 1965, shed light on the dynamics of the family during the campaign. Instead of expressing regret or worry about their actions, the entries show a family that had persuaded itself that their targets deserved whatever psychological suffering they experienced. Morai says, "A man who takes what belongs to another has already chosen to live outside the protection of decent society." She wrote in March of 1888. "The boys understand this. We are not causing harm to innocent people. We are simply allowing guilty men to experience the consequences of their own choices." This rationalization appears to have been shared by all family members and may have been crucial in maintaining their psychological stability while conducting their campaign. By framing their actions as justice rather than revenge, they avoided the moral conflicts that might have undermined their effectiveness. The campaign reached its climax in the spring of 1888, when the remaining targets began disappearing from the county. These were not violent disappearances accompanied by evidence of struggle or foul play. Instead, families simply packed their belongings and left the area, often in the middle of the night, abandoning property and valuables in their rush to escape. Augustus Cromwell left a letter explaining his departure that was discovered by neighbors and eventually given over to county officials. The note recorded in county archives read simply, "Cannot bear the watching any more. They may be in every darkness." Throughout the spring and summer of 1888, similar departures took place, and by fall, all 12 of the men on Morai's initial list had either perished or suffered. "Every sound might be a warning, taking my family where they cannot follow," Luman said. Mental collapse or fled the county. The Hatfield family had achieved their goal of making those they held responsible pay for the theft of their still, but they had done so through methods that were arguably more devastating than traditional violence. The effectiveness of their campaign created a lasting impact on the community that extended far beyond the immediate targets. Other families in the county became acutely aware of the price of crossing the Hatfield clan and began modifying their behavior accordingly. The psychological terrorism campaign had created a climate of fear that affected community dynamics for years afterward. County officials tried to look into the pattern of departures and mental breakdowns, but they encountered the same obstacles that had hindered law enforcement throughout the frontier period. The remote location, the lack of direct evidence of criminal activity. Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood, whose jurisdiction included Newton County, filed a report with state authorities in September 1888, requesting assistance in investigating what he described as systematic intimidation and coercion by the Hatfield family. The report, found in state archives in 1961, provides one of the few official acknowledgments of the campaign's effectiveness. But no, the pattern of psychological distress, property abandonment, and population displacement in the vicinity of the Hatfield property strongly suggests organized intimidation, Blackwood said, citing the ability to directly prove illegal action. The family has achieved through terror what others could accomplish by violence, but the legal remedies available for addressing such acts are restricted under current statutes. Succubized. The state's response to Blackwood's request was minimal. A single investigator was sent to Newton County in October of 1888, but his 2E investigation yielded no evidence of specific criminal acts. The investigator's report, also found in state archives, noted the unusual number of recent property transfers and relocations in the area, but concluded that while suspicious, these events do not constitute evidence of criminal behavior sufficient to warrant prosecution. Following the state investigation, the Hatfield family gradually reduced their visibility in the community. They ceased their attendance at social events, limited their interactions with neighbors, and returned to the isolation that had characterized their existence before the theft of their still. This withdrawal was not complete invisibility, but rather a strategic reduction in contact that maintained their psychological presence while limiting their exposure to further official scrutiny. The final phase of the campaign occurred in late 1888 and early 1889, when the few remaining men, who had been on Mordai's original list but had not yet fled the county, began experiencing what can only be described as total social and economic isolation. Businesses refused to serve them. Neighbors avoided contact, and even family members began distancing themselves to avoid being associated with the perceived curse that seemed to follow anyone who had crossed the Hatfield family. This social exile was perhaps more devastating than the earlier psychological terrorism because it removed the last vestiges of normal, human contact and community support. The men found themselves living as outcasts in their own communities, unable to conduct business, maintain relationships, or participate in the social structures that defined frontier life. Jeremiah Quincy, who had remained in the county despite his earlier nervous collapse, provides the most detailed record of this final phase through letters he wrote to relatives in other states. These letters, discovered among family papers in 1964, describe a gradual descent into complete. "No one speaks to me anymore," he wrote in December 1888. "When I enter the general store, other customers leave." This was an example of social invisibility. "The shopkeeper serves me, but will not meet my eyes. Even my own neighbors wander among the living, passing my house without acknowledging me, as though I've passed away. I begin to understand why the others departed. This is not life as God intended it." Quincy's final letter, dated January 15, 1889, was written to his sister in Missouri. "I cannot remain here any longer. The weight of their attention has grown painful. Even when I see none of them, I know they are watching. I can tell they're listening even if I can't hear anything. A man cannot live under such scrutiny without losing his wits. Tomorrow I'm heading somewhere their eyes can't follow." Quincy's departure signified the completion of Morai Hatfield's mission of revenge. All 12 men he had held guilty for the theft of his still had been driven from the county or put to such psychological ruin that they posed no additional threat to his family's interests. The campaign had taken 18 months to finish and had been performed with a systematic precision that revealed advanced understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The aftermath of the campaign generated permanent effects in Newton County that endured for decades. The abrupt departure of 12 families, together with their close acquaintances and extended relatives, drastically decreased the area's population and changed its economic structure. Several businesses closed owing to lack of clients, and the remaining populace grew considerably more insular and wary in their relations with strangers. More crucially, the psychological procedures utilized by the Hatfield family became part of local legend and shaped how disagreements were conducted in the region for generations afterward. Direct confrontation was strongly discouraged by the possibility of falling victim to comparable psychological warfare, which resulted in a culture of indirect communication and careful avoidance of acts that might be construed as antagonistic. The Hatfield family themselves continued to dwell in Newton County until Morai's death in 1902. He lived the remainder of his life as a dignified patriarch who had successfully protected his family's interests against those who would take advantage of them. His sons carried on with their business in the county, but they were seldom opposed because of their reputation for deliberate brutality. Directly. Temperance Hatfield's later journal entries covering the period from 1890 to her death in 1895 portray a woman who had become progressively isolated by her awareness of what her family had accomplished. Although she persisted in using moral arguments to defend their conduct, her writings reveal a growing skepticism over the psychological toll their campaign would take on both their targets and herself. "Morai speaks often about justice being served," she wrote in 1893. "But I sometimes worry if we have become something other than what God intended when we opted to repay theft with such utter destruction. The men who mistreated us are gone, but the weight of their departure remains with us. We live now in a county that fears us, and there are times when I am not persuaded that fear and respect are the same thing." The historical account of the Ozark Massacre, as it came to be called in local tradition, was mostly forgotten outside of Newton County until 1959, when the demolition of the old Hatfield homestead led to the finding of Morai's thorough documentation. These documents, coupled with the different journals, letters, and official reports that appeared over the following decade, provided the first full account of what had truly occurred during those 18 months in 1887 and 1888. The Hatfield campaign was one of the most advanced instances of organized psychological warfare recorded in American frontier history, according to Dr. Harrison Metcalf, a psychology professor at the University of Arkansas, who researched the case in 1967. The family had used psychological procedures that would not be properly understood by clinical psychology for several decades, according to his analysis, which was published in an academic journal that year. The Hatfield family displayed a knowledge of isolation anxiety, social ostracism, and psychological manipulation that shows either outstanding innate insight into human nature or past familiarity with such approaches. Their capacity to sustain the campaign, wrote Metcalf, over an extended period while avoiding direct criminal exposure indicates planning and emotional control that approaches the level of organized psychological operations. The case attracted the attention of federal researchers in the late 1960s who were studying historical examples of psychological warfare for military applications. However, civilian researchers are still unable to access their classified discoveries, though some have argued that the Hatfield methods affected later military psychological operations. Moreover, the lasting impact of the Ozark Massacre on the local populace was recorded in a sociological research undertaken by graduate students from the University of Arkansas in 1965. The study indicated that even 77 years after the events, people of Newton County demonstrated higher than average rates of social anxiety, suspicion of outsiders, and avoidance behaviors when compared to residents of nearby counties, according to the interviews done by this study, rumors regarding the Hatfield. For 3 decades, the campaign had been handed down through families, frequently with additions that heightened its psychological effect. Many locals related how the fate of the 12 men who had betrayed the Hatfield family was specifically linked to warnings they received as children about the perils of attracting attention or creating enemies. One elderly citizen, whose grandpa had been a neighbor of the Hatfields, told researchers, "My granddaddy always maintained there were things worse than dying, and that the Hatfields understood what those." He stated, "A man could lose everything that made life worth living without ever being touched by a hand or threatened with a weapon." Our family learned this lesson, and I believe others did too. Long until the 1960s, locals avoided the actual site of the Hatfield homestead. After the family left the property, no one bought it, even though the land had economic worth for farming or development. According to local real estate brokers, possible. After learning about the location's past, buyers would back out of their offers, and multiple attempts to develop the area were shelved because of the workers' unwillingness to stay. In 1967, a team of researchers from the Smithsonian Institution sought to perform an archaeological survey of the Hatfield property as part of a larger study of frontier settlement trends. The experiment was discontinued after 3 weeks after team members reported feeling unusual psychological stress while working at the site. The project manager. According to the final report sent to the Smithsonian in December 1967, team members had trouble falling asleep, were more anxious, and continued to feel like they were being watched while working there. While we cannot establish the cause of these psychological effects, the report concluded, the consistency of symptoms among team members suggests that the place itself may have preserved some environmental element that negatively impacts human psychological well-being. Given the known history of psychological trauma involved with this location, we urge that any archaeological work be postponed forever. The scholarly interest in the case steadily faded through the late 1960s and early 1970s, as original records became increasingly difficult to access. A number of important documents vanished from archives under mysterious circumstances, and the Hatfields and their targets' surviving relatives stopped cooperating with researchers. By 1970, much of the physical evidence. of the case had been misplaced, destroyed, or rendered unusable. Further, archaeological research was essentially prohibited because the original homestead site had been acquired by the federal government to be included in a national forest preserve. The county courthouse, where many official papers had been held, experienced a fire in 1968 that destroyed substantial amounts of the history collection, including most documents pertaining to the Hatfield case. The few researchers who persisted to analyze the case found themselves faced the same kind of methodical blockage that had marked the initial events. Equipment would malfunction. Access permissions would be terminated without explanation, and critical sources would become inaccessible soon before scheduled interviews. While no outright threats were made, the pattern of interference was so persistent that numerous researchers thought they were being purposefully discouraged from completing their investigation. Dr. Harrison Metcalf, whose analysis from 1967 was the most thorough scholarly investigation of the example, attempted to submit a follow-up study in 1972, but found that the magazine that had published his original work was no longer interested in the subject. Other academic periodicals similarly declined to consider his manuscript, citing issues about historical verification and academic relevance. Metcalf's unpublished article discovered among his documents following his death in 1984 shows that his further study had uncovered linkages between the Hatfield case and similar occurrences of systematic psychological terrorism in other areas of the boundary. His notes indicate that he had began to suspect that the strategies utilized by the Hatfield family were not new innovations, but rather implementations of principles that had been used by other families and organizations throughout the American frontier period. In one portion of the book, he said, "The sophistication of the Hatfield psychological operations suggests that such techniques may have been more common in frontier society than previously understood." Traditional historical scholarship has mostly ignored the systematic psychological warfare techniques that may have been developed as a result of frontier towns' isolation, the ineffectiveness of law enforcement, and the need for deterrent effects against possible threats. Metcalf's research notes also suggest that he had uncovered similar incidents in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, all involving extended family groups who had utilized psychological terrorism to eliminate perceived threats while steering clear of direct criminal prosecution. However, the facts of these other cases remain unknown, as his study materials disappeared from the university archives following his death. The last significant scholarly assessment of the Ozark Massacre was done in 1978 by a team of scholars from the University of Missouri, who attempted to verify the basic facts of the case through oral history interviews with elderly people of Newton County. After 6 months, the study was shelved since the research team could not locate someone who is open to going into great detail about what happened. The research leader's final report, filed with the university in 1979, indicated that while locals definitely knew about the historical events, they displayed an extraordinary unwillingness to share particular information, even concerning topics that occurred before they were born. Despite proof that their families had been personally impacted by the events, several prospective interview participants claimed to be unaware of the case. The level of hush surrounding this. The report stated, "This historical incident is unlike anything we have encountered in other oral history projects." Even residents whose family emigrated to the area decades after the events express reluctance to discuss the subject, showing that the community has established cultural strategies for avoiding investigation of these particular historical occurrences. Outside of Newton County, the Ozark Massacre is still mostly forgotten over a century later. Additionally, it is increasingly prevalent even within the county, as oral tradition rather than written history. The few remaining records are distributed among several archives and private collections, making extensive examination practically impossible. The majority of the original settlement patterns have been erased because the physical sites connected to the events have been developed for other purposes or absorbed into government territory. However, the case's psychological effects are still subtly influencing Newton County culture. Residents still display higher than normal levels of social caution, indirect communication strategies, and avoidance of direct confrontation. Local law enforcement reports extremely low rates of property crime and interpersonal problems, which may reflect the lingering deterrent effect of the Hatfield example. A chilling reminder of the potential for deliberate cruelty in human nature is provided by the tale of Mori Hatfield and his methodical campaign of psychological retaliation. Without resorting to physical violence, the Hatfield family demonstrated that it was possible to destroy lives, families, and entire communities by the systematic application of fear, isolation, and psychological pressure. The evidence that their tactics were successful not only against their immediate targets, but also in bringing about long-lasting behavioral changes in the community that lasted for generations, is perhaps the most alarming. The Ozark Massacre is a case study on the potential of psychological terrorism to achieve social control through the creation of pervasive dread and the demonstration that resistance to specific individuals or families would end in more terrible repercussions than death itself. The 12 men who disappeared from Newton County in 1887 and 1888 were not slain in any traditional sense, yet they were functionally removed as assuredly as if they had been shot or hanged. Their destiny serves as a reminder that human evil can take forms that are far more subtle and arguably more destructive than outright violence, and that the American frontier produced not only famed gunfighters and vicious outlaws, but also men capable of psychological warfare strategies that would not be out of place in modern military or intelligence operations. In the end, the true horror of the Ozark Massacre lies not in what was done to the 12 men, but in how completely and systematically it was accomplished, and in the evidence that such techniques may have been far more common in frontier society than traditional historical accounts suggest. The Hatfield family's effort gives a glimpse into a darker element of American frontier psychology, one that makes clear the ability for regular families to become agents of planned psychological harm when they feel themselves to be defending their fundamental interests. The silence that has enveloped this case for more than a century may itself be part of the Hatfield legacy, a community-wide psychological scar that continues to impact behavior long after the original culprits and victims have passed away. The Ozark Massacre serves as a reminder in a culture that prioritizes decisive action and unambiguous moral distinctions. That the most deadly types of human conflict may be those that work below the surface in the world of fear, uncertainty, and psychological manipulation, where traditional concepts of justice and law enforcement have little capacity to act. This tale continues to reverberate throughout the Arkansas mountains through the caution that controls interpersonal connections, the whispered warnings that are passed down from generation to generation, and the awareness that some families have information and skills that extend much beyond what their outer appearance might suggest. The Hatfield name may no longer strike fear into the hearts of Newton County residents, but the methods they pioneered continue to serve as a template for psychological dominance that requires no weapons other than patience, intelligence, and an understanding of the human need for community acceptance and psychological security.